Shalom, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. I'm recording again ahead of time, but today's daf that we're recording is daf Yud Bet, and we are calling in from Jerusalem. So yesterday's daf, I did it last night. We got up to the last line on Yud Aleph Amud Bet. So the last line says Tanu Rabbanan. We're talking about the question of when you can make a leap year. So says the Braita, Ein Ma'abrin Tashana, you never make a leap year, B'shnei Batzor, B'shnei Ra'avon, in a year of hunger, top of Daf Yud Bet Amud Aleph. Remember, we talked yesterday a little bit, and we're going to get into it more, the criteria for a leap year. If the tekufa is off, if the grain is not ripe, if the people are traveling and not there yet. But the problem is that all of that is conditional to some extent because there are other things you have to take into account. And this example is a famine. A famine is a year where there's not a lot of food. Remember that you're not allowed to eat the grain until Pesach, right? Until the second day of Pesach, you bring the Karban Omer, you can't bring any new grain. So you could have a situation where people have no food. Food ripens, but they can't eat it because you have to wait till Pesach. So if you delay the Pesach by a month by making a leap year, you're going to really inconvenience a lot of people who are starving to death. So you cannot make a leap year b'shnei ra'avon. Now this implies even if otherwise you would have been willing to make it a leap year. And Tanya, in fact, there's a Braita that supports that. Haya Rebbe Omer, the Braita inside, you probably have the Girsa Haya Rebbe Meir Omer, that the pasuk says, very interesting pasuk by Elisha. Ish ba mi Baal Shlisha, the man came from the place called Baal Shlisha. V'yavo le'ish Elohim, he brought to the man of God, which was Elisha, lechem bikurim esrim, 20 loaves of lechem bikurim, meaning the first grains. Lechem Saorim, it continues. Says the Gemara, the pasuk is very interesting because there's no place in the whole land of Israel that ripens their grain first for Baal Shlisha. That's I don't know where it is, but that's the first place that grain becomes ripe in the whole land of Israel. So grain that's grown in Baal Shlisha gets ripe first. And Afal Pikein lo bichra ela min echad. This was the lechem bikurim, meaning they're coming to Elisha with the first fruit, and there's only one type, which is sorim. There's no other types. So clearly it hasn't, all the grains have not ripened. It has to be very delayed. It's going to be a very late harvest, right? Shema tomarna, you might say, how do you know it was sorim? Sorim is barley, which ripens first. Chitin, if you recall, becomes ripe second. Maybe it was chitim. So that's why the pasuk says, Talmud lomar seorim, lechem sorim, that he brought bread that was barley. So clearly, there was a shortage. Sorry, not a shortage. Clearly, the grain was just coming to be, right? It was just maturing when they brought it to Elisha. Now says the Gemara, maybe they brought it to Elisha very early in the harvesting season. How do you know it was late in the harvesting season? Maybe it was early. Shema Tomar Lefnei Omer. Maybe they brought it to Elisha before the Karban Omer, meaning before Pesach. Talmud Omer, the pasuk says afterwards, Elisha said, Tein la'am v'yochlu. Give it to the people and they'll eat it. You can't eat grain until after the Omer. So clearly, achar ha'omer haya, right? It was clearly after the Omer. Now, what's very strange about that is that if only a tiny bit of grain is ready after the Omer, that seems to be a prime year to make a leap year, right? Because if all the grain is going to become ready at the end of Nisan or Siva or Iyar, then add a month of Adar, and then that month will be 1 month earlier. It says, why didn't Elisha make it a leap year? And more me'ata, you can see from here that year it should have been a leap year because the grain was really delayed. And so only a tiny bit of grain was ready before Pesach, and so they should have made it a leap year. Why didn't Elisha, who was in charge, make it a leap year? Because it was a famine. And because it was a famine, which is how the story continues, he gave it to the people to eat, he couldn't make it a leap year. So even though the regular rules would make it a leap year, this was not made into a leap year because it was a famine. Everyone was going to the granot, the harvesting floors, to get grain because they were starving. Tanur Rabbanan continues the Braita, a third of the way down, a quarter of the way down. You can't remember, Ibor Shana is a year at a time, right? So this year, you start at Nisan, you add a month at the end of Adar. You're not allowed to announce this and do it before Rosh Hashanah, meaning before the first day of Tishrei, 6 months ahead of time. Why? Well, we'll see why in a second. But if you do it, it doesn't work. If you announce in the summer that there's going to be an extra Adar, it doesn't count. You have to do it again after Rosh Hashanah. Aval mipnei adchak, if you're really in a stressful period, ma'abrinoto, the Rashi seems to have a slightly different gersi here, but ma'abrinoto, you make it a leap year that it's going to be, meaning you can sort of decide in the summer before Rosh Hashanah that this year is going to be a leap year, and achar Rosh Hashanah miyad. Sorry, you could be ma'abrin. Sorry, the writer's words are ma'abrin oto achar Rosh Hashanah miyad. You could do it immediately after Rosh Hashanah. So really, you're supposed to do it as late as possible, I guess, to see what the weather does and what's happening. But if you're really unsure, if really be'atchak, you can do it right after Rosh Hashanah. V'afal pikein, and even though you can do it right after Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei, the month that's extra is, of course, not anywhere Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tezvain. It's Ein Mabrin Ella Adar. The extra month is going to be the month of Adar. Says Gemara, is that really true? But the extra month, we'll see, is only Adar. Aini, is that true? Vasholchale the Rava. They sent an interesting, fascinating kind of coded message to Rava, and of course, this was Rashba makes it. It explains that Ne'atzchak before was because the government often, would stop the Jews from controlling their calendar, right? It was one method of foreign control, was that you'd have to follow the Greek or the Roman calendar, as it might be. So there was a time with Rava, who was, of course, after the Mishnah and lived in a time of persecution, and they sent a message to Rava, the Rava. They sent a message to Rava that said, Zug be ba mirakat. There's a pair referring to a pair of rabbis, a pair of Adim, basically, coming from Rakat. Rakat is a name that the pasuk in Yoshua uses for Tiberia. They come from Israel, basically, to the Bavel. Utfason Nesher. They were captured by Nesher. Literally means an eagle, but that was interesting, right? Rashi explains that it was the army, and everyone knows, at least I think everyone who watches TV, that the Roman army symbol was an eagle. So they were grabbed by the eagle. Ubiyadod varim hana'asim beluz. In their hands, they had things that are made in Luz. Luz is a very famous city from the Torah as well, but the tradition is that in Luz, they used to make the tchelet. It says, they had tchelet, which again was something that was very much illegal in those times because it symbolized the kingship and the Kohanim and the specialness of Klal Yisrael. So they had things that were, illegal, basically, contraband. U bischut harachamim, through the grace of God, basically, bischutam, and through their merit, yatzu b'shalom. They got out, they were released in peace. Right? Now, that's not the point of the story we're interested in. The next part of the story is the Amusei Yerechim Nachshon. Those who come from the Yerechim, those who come from the offspring of Nachshon. We just read in Hanukkah, right? The first Nasi was Nachshon, the Nasi of Yom Rishon, Nachshon ben Aminadav. Those who come from Nachshon, meaning the family of the Nasi, Bikshu Likvo Nitziv Echad. They wanted to add on an extra Nitziv, and Nitziv means a month. We're going to translate in a minute. V'lo nichon adomi alaz. And this Adomi, this Roman government, did not allow them to do it. Aval, Balei Asufot Nesfu, but the Balei Asufot, which we say refers to Talmidei Chachamim, those who gather things together, got together. The Kavulo Nitziv, they added on an extra month. But the last words in the message are, B'yerech shemet bo Aaron HaKohen, in the month that Aaron HaKohen died, which, as we know from the Torah, is Av, the 5th month of the year. So nowhere, how could you say you added on a month? Now, obviously, they didn't make Av the extra month, but it seems like they got together in the summer, and Av, that's when they had access to rabbis, and they made it an extra a leap year. And we just said you can't do it before Tishrei. Answers the Gemara, well, that was when they could get together, right? So Cheshuvi Mechashvi, they were able to plan it. They could do the thinking and the idea, but Giluye Lo Megali, you can't reveal it. You can't announce it until after Rosh Hashanah. Rashi says because we're afraid people are going to forget. It's a little strange, like why people would forget, but you want to do it closer to the time. Now, in the message, they said they wanted to add one nitziv. Nitziv literally means a nitziv is like a pillar, right? So what does that mean? We're going to add 1 month. How do you know nitziv is called a month? Because if you recall, Shlomo in the beginning of Melachim, it says, Shlomo shneim asar nitzivim al kol Yisrael. Shlomo had 12 nitzivim, we translate them usually as, governors or supporters, because their job was kilkilu et hamelech ve'et anashav et beito chodesh b'shana. Each one was in charge of 1 month's support. So he had people, we call them donors basically nowadays, but he had people who would support him, but they were called nitziv echad, and nitziv was referring to a month, because each one was in charge of 1 month. But there's another pasuk that says nitziv echad asher ba'aretz, there's one. So how do you say it's a month if there's only one? That was the super in charge guy. So there was 12 governors, but one super governor. And Chad Amar Keneged Chodesh Ibor. One says that no, Shlomo had an extra person in order, if it was a leap year, that person provided food during the extra month. Right? You need to count for the extra month. It's a long time. And so he had a 13th person established for that responsibility. Okay, back to our topic of Ibur Shana. Tanur Abanan says the Braita, 2/3 of the way down, Ein ma'avrin et hashana, lo mishana lechaverta. You cannot announce 1 year, oh, next year is going to be a leap year. Okay, meaning if the conditions are ripe and you're planning, you're like, well, it's close and we're worried about schedule and things like that. You cannot plan for 1 year for the next year, at least finalize the plans. You can't do 3 years one after the other. It's Rashi's first pshat. He doesn't like that pshat very much. And he says 3 years means you can't take 3 years into account when you are planning the leap year. Meaning, don't say, well, this year, the next year it turns out the rains are early, or there's a special calendar, or the grains are not going to be ripe. You can't take 3 years of data into account further, future data, you take past data, when you're planning the leap years. Amar Rabbi Shimon, says Rabbi Shimon Maaseh Rabbi Akiva. There was a story with Rabbi Akiva, Shechavush B'Beit Asurim. Unfortunately, he was a captive of the Romans who ultimately would kill him, as we learned yesterday. We didn't talk about Akiva, we talked about the Asar Harugei Malchut. But he was in prison. He was he was limited in his communication, and we were able to get access to him. V'iber shalosh shanim zu achar zu. He was ma'aber 3 years, one after the other. Again, it doesn't mean 3 years in a row, but it means 3 years. He planned. He said, okay, next year should be a leap year, and 5 years should be a leap year. This is, of course, very familiar to us, because this is what we do. We have a calendar where we mapped out the leap years. But Rabbi Akiva did something like that. And so that seems to be a question, right? So says the Gemara, how could you just say you're not allowed to do it? And then you bring a story. Rabbi Shimon was arguing. He was saying, what do you mean? Rabbi Akiva did it 3 years in a row. And they said to him, Amrulo, Misham Raya, you're bringing a proof from Rabbi Akiva in prison? It just means Rabbi Akiva advised them, because they were afraid he was going to get killed, and he was killed, and they didn't have his access. He gave them information, and then when the time came, they went back to their notes, and they said Rabbi Akiva made this idea, and Beit Din sat in each special year and did it. And when we say you can't do 3 years in a row, what we mean is you can't do them at one time. You can't sit down and say, next year's a leap year, and 4 years is a leap year. You have to do it in Bismanu. Tanur Rabbanan, says the Braita, you can't make an Ibr year if it's Shemitah, and that of course makes sense because there's not a lot of food in Shemitah, and so you don't want to extend the year by 1 more month where people can't plant and farm. But you also can't do it after Shemitah, because remember, the year after Shemitah starts in Tishrei, but you cannot, and you can start working the land, but you can't eat the grain until you bring the carbon Omer on Pesach, right? And so if you make it a leap year, you delay the new grain by 1 more month. We ran out of grain from Shemitah already because no one planted the field last year. And so the new grain you can't eat. And so people are going to be starving. So you're not supposed to make leap year the year after Shemitah. Now, when is it a really good time to make an extra month? Erev Shviat, the year before Shemitah, because that gives everyone an extra month to plant and grow and harvest, right? So it's very convenient if you add a month in the year before Shemitah. Now, in Beit Rabbi Gamliel, Yomabrin Motzei Shviat, but in Rabbi Gamliel's place, they actually didn't care about this halacha. They argued. And they said, no problem, make a leap year in the year after Shemitah. What about the fact that you're not going to get food, right? Remember, Shemitah you can't plant. Once Shemitah is over, you can plant all you want, but you can't eat the fresh fruit until Rosh Hashanah, until you bring the carbon Omer on Pesach. So if you make an extra Adar, you're delaying the new food by a month. Says the Gemara, but it's beplukta Dani. Tonight, it's dependent on the following machloket. The Tanya, ein miviin yerek michutza la'aretz. Some say that during Shemitah, you're not allowed to bring vegetables from outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? Which of course means that you're very limited in the food that you have. The Rabbeinu hitiru. But the Rabbeinu, which is what we're saying is Rabbi Gamliel's opinion, he permitted that. So if you can bring external food, which of course is what they do today in great quantities, then Shemitah is not as big a deal. Because even though you can't plant in Israel, and you can't get the regular food, you can bring in from Chutz La'aretz. And my Benai, what do they argue about? Of course, nobody argues about whether you can have food from Chutz La'aretz. The question is, if you bring vegetables, then they might come along with gusheim. Gusheim means the dirt that comes with them. And they were very careful not to be in contact with the dirt from Chutz La'aretz, because the assumption was it was filled with Tuma, either because there are dead bodies everywhere, or because they made a gezerah of Tuma on Eretz Amimim. They made a gezerah of Tuma on foreign lands. So they didn't want to bring in food because they didn't want the tomatoes with the dirt that comes along with them. According to Rabbi Gamliel, it's not a problem. And so therefore, it doesn't matter if you make it a leap year, because if you're not going to run out of food, you'll just get produce from Jordan or wherever they got it from. Taner Rabbanan, 6 lines on the bottom. Fascinating halacha. You shouldn't make it a leap year because people are tamei. Now, what does it mean because people are tamei? So we assume it means that you can't bring the carbon pesach, right? Carbon pesach is coming. If you're tamei, you can't bring the carbon. So what if a lot of people are tamei? Give them an extra month. Says the Gemara, Rashi explains, right? What do you mean? Well, why is that a problem? The leap year, if you recall, is done in Adar. So, and you can only make it till the end of Adar. So why would you be worried if people are tamei? Let them just become tahar, right? Why do you need a leap year? They have at least 2 weeks before you're going to make a decision. So some say they might not have water. They might have run out of mayim of the paraduma. So they have to get another animal. They have to prepare it. It's a whole process. But Rashi has a beautiful explanation that maybe it's talking about a situation where there's a very senior person like the Nasi who's sick, and the doctors or whoever decides realize that he is likely to die in 3 weeks on a week before Pesach. So once he dies a week before Pesach, everyone in Bnei Yisrael has to go become mitamei to go to his levaya and be part of the kever and be part of the room. And because there's a responsibility, we have a prediction now that someone's going to die in 2 weeks, everyone's going to become tamei, and then Pesach's going to come and we're not going to be able to bring the carbon Pesach. So let's make an extra year, right? So you would have thought that, says the Braita, you cannot do that. Let's read inside. Taner Rabban, where am I? You can't do it. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can do it. Ma'abrim. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, if you're worried, everyone's going to become tamei, make it an extra month so that they become tahor. Rabbi Yehuda brings a story, which seems to contradict what he just said. There was a story with Chizkiyahu, the king of Yehuda, that he actually did this. Everyone was tamei, someone was dying, whatever the reason. He said, okay, we're going to add an extra adar so people have time to become tahor. But it was, which is what Rabbi Yehuda said you're allowed to do. But here says Rabbi Yehuda, it was a mistake. Ubikesh rachamim al atzmo. He asked God to have compassion because he made this mistake. Because the pasuk says, that many of the people from Ephraim, Menashe, Yisachar, Zebulun were not tahor. Turn the page to Yebet Amabet. And he therefore made it an extra year, but extra leap year. So he made an extra adar, and continues the pasuk in Divrei Yamim when it describes the story of Chizkiyahu. It says, "Ki achlu et Pesach below kakatuv," because they ate the Pesach not the way it's written, meaning against the wishes of the Torah. Ki hitpalel Chizkiyahu alihem, and Chizkiyahu then had to pray for them. Leimar Hashem atov yichaper ba'ad, that God the good should forgive us. But it says Rabbi Yehuda, you see from the Chizkiyahu that he was a mistake, because all the people were tamei, is what the Torah says. Chizkiyahu made it a leap year, and it turns out he wasn't supposed to. Now, of course, that contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda just said, right? Because the Braita started by saying Tanakama said, don't do it for Tumah. Rabbi Yehuda said, no problem. And then he brings the story of Chizkiyahu who did it and regretted it. We'll ask that question in a second. But that's the second opinion. The third opinion of the Braita, the third line of Yud Bet Amud Bet, is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, look, no, if Chizkiyahu had made a leap year because people were tamei, that wouldn't be a problem. There's no reason to ask forgiveness. Why did he ask for forgiveness? Because you're only allowed to make it a leap year when it's still Adar. And who? Iber Nisan ben Nisan. He made an extra, added a month of Nisan in the month of Nisan. Now we're going to explain that in a second. It's not really what happened, but that's what it sounds like. The fourth opinion of the Braita is Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Nipnei she'isiyat Yisrael asot Pesach Sheni. That the reason that Chizkiyahu asked for forgiveness is that he made a mistake by making people go do Pesach Sheni, and we'll see what it was a mistake about making them do Pesach Sheni in a minute. So now let's analyze this whole Braita. 2 dots. Amar Mar. Rabbi Yehuda says, eight ma'abrin, that you're allowed to make it a leap year, okay? So if you're worried about Tumah, you can make it a leap year. Why? So what's the machloket? Tanakama says don't do it. Rabbi Yehuda says do it. Says the Gemara, what you see from here is Rabbi Yehuda holds Tumah is dichuya b'tzibur. meaning that if everyone is tamei, remember we have halacha for either a majority of the people, as we learned in Psachim, or a karban tzibor, that if you're tamei, you can still do it b'tumah. Now, this raises a lot of questions about Hanukkah, because if you're allowed to do it b'tumah, why couldn't they just light on Hanukkah b'tumah? But that's a really good Hanukkah question, so I'll leave it to everyone. But the halacha is that if you have tumah, that's tumah tzibor, most of the tzibor or the Kohen Gadol or something like that, you are mutar to do it bituma, right? You're allowed to. There's a big debate we had in Sachim about whether tuma is hutra b'tzibor. It's permitted, meaning go ahead and do it, no problem. So be tamei and do the karban. Or tuma is dichuya b'tzibor, meaning tuma is pushed off. It's still not ideal, but the prohibition is lighter, which would imply that if you can get out of doing it, you should get out of doing it. So let's say you have a situation where the majority of people are going to be tamei when Pesach comes, right? So according to the one who says Tuma Hutra B'tzibor, that's not a problem. Just do the Karban Pesach B'Tuma. And you don't need to make it a leap year. According to the one who says Tuma Dechuya B'tzibor, okay, we would willing let the tzibor do it B'Tuma if we had no alternative. But if we have an alternative, which is namely to make it a leap year, let's make it a leap year. So here the Tanna Kama says don't do it. He must hold Tuma is Dechuya B'Tzibor, sorry. Hutuma is Hutra B'Tzibor. It's permitted, so no need to make a leap year. Just do it B'Tuma. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we want to make a leap year if we can, because Tuma is Dechuya B'Tzibor. So I'll read that all inside now. It says Gemara Alma, what you see, it's later Rabbi Yehuda, Tuma Dechuya B'Tzibor. You see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that when someone is tamei and doing karban tzibor, which is allowed, it's not ideal. It's done bidi avad. It's dichuya. But we have a braita which seems to contradict that. Hatanya, the braita talks about the tzitz. Remember, the Kohen Gadol, every Kohen has to be tahor. But the tzitz is, and we're going to have this in the next Masechet in Shavuot, which is 2 from here, that the tzitz allows for, basically purifies tumah that happens. So says the Braita, tzitz, the Kohen Gadol's tzitz, the crown that he wore, bein sheyeshnu ha-metzcho, whether he's wearing it at that time, or bein she'einu ha-metzcho, he's not wearing it, it's on the shelf in his house, niratzeh. It purifies. And if you do things with tumah, you're not allowed to, but b'diavad it works. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, he's got to be wearing it. Odo al metzcho miratzeh. The Kohen Gadol's wearing the tzitz, then it's like a force field, right, for tumah. But ein odo al metzcho inu miratzeh. But if he's not wearing it, it doesn't work. Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yehuda, Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. What about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur? You don't wear the tzitz on Yom Kippur because it's not one of the big day lavan, right? It's one of the big day zahav, basically. So you don't wear the tzitz when you wear the special begadim that you go lifnai v'lifnim. But it's meratzeh. So Rabbi Shimon said to Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur yochiach she'eno ha-mitzcho meratzeh. He's not wearing it and he still gets purified from tum'ah. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, 1 second. Yom Kippur is very different because on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is doing a karban not for himself, but for all of Klal Yisrael, right? And Hanach Yom Kippurim, leave aside Yom Kippur because Yom Kippur is different to Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. Because on Yom Kippur, it's a karban tzibor, and Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor. And so since Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, you can bring it on Yom Kippur, even if you're Tameh, even though you're not wearing the tzitz. But here Rabbi Yehuda is saying Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, and by Ibur Shana, he said Tumah Dechuya, because if Tumah was Hutra, in Ibur Shana, then why don't you just forget about the fact that people are tamei? Don't add an extra month. Let them do the karban pesach when they're tamei. So that's a question. Where am I? Says the Gemara, it's a great question. But you want to know something? Rabbi Yehuda made no sense anyways. Because Rabbi Yehuda first said, you're allowed to make an extra year, an extra month in the year because of Tumah. And then he told a story of Chizkiyahu HaMelech who did it and regretted it. So how could you say it's the right thing to do if Chizkiyahu regrets it? You should ask the question from the Braita itself. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ma'abrin. Rabbi Yehuda said you're allowed to do it. Then he brings a story and says you're not allowed to do it. We're reading now the Braita. Rabbi Yehuda, he asked for compassion. Clearly he made a mistake. Ella chasurim mechasu. Clearly there's a detail missing in this Braita. Let us clarify the whole thing. Hachi katani. This is what the Braita should say. Ein ma'abrinet tashana bnei atuma is what the Tanna Kama said. Don't do it. It's not a good idea to make an extra year bnei atuma. But if you do, if you do it, okay, it works. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do it at all. Not Rabbi Yehuda says you can do it. Rabbi Yehuda says you can eno me'uberet, and I have a proof for you. Amar Rabbi Yehuda the Maasev Chizkiyahu HaMelech, who did it and regretted it. So you see, it's not the right thing to do. Ihachi says, well, then what's the third opinion in the Braita? What did Rabbi Shimon come to add then? Rabbi Shimon Omer, now we're quoting the Braita, if Chizkiyahu did it because it was Tumah, then it's okay. But what Chizkiyahu did wrong was something else, right? But that's Hainu Tanakama. The Tanakama said the exact same thing, that you're not supposed to do it, but if you do it, it's okay. So now Rabbi Shimon is coming and saying the exact same thing as the Tanakama says, don't do it, but it's okay if you do. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not okay, and Chizkiyahu is the proof. And Rabbi Shimon comes and says it's okay. So that's the Tanakama. Says the Gemara, but one is saying is you're allowed to, and one is saying b'diavad. Amar Rava lechatchila ika beinayim. Question of whether it's okay after the fact or it's okay before the fact is the difference. Tanya Namiyachi, in fact, there's a Braita which lays this all out, because the Braita says, we're on the eighth to last narrow line, Ein ma'abrin et hashana mipnei hatuma lichatchila. Don't add a month lichatchila. If b'diavad, if you do it, it's okay. Rabbi Shimon says, we're leaving out Rabbi Yehuda here, who says you can't do it at all. Rabbi Shimon says, no problem. Me'abrim, just you can make an extra month for Tumah. So then why was Chizkiyahu so sad about what he did? Because you can only be ma'aber adar. And he was ma'aber Nisan. He added an extra month of Nisan in Nisan. We bear Nisan b'Nisan. Says let's quote that inside. Fourth last narrow line. Adar. You only can make a leap year, a month of Adar. Nisan b'Nisan. Says really? You think he did that? But let's the Chizkiyahu, the pasuk of Chodesh Hazeh Lechem. We dash from the word Hazeh. This month is Chodesh, meaning Zen Nisan, Meinachar Nisan. There's only one Nisan. You can't add a second Nisan. So yes, obviously he didn't try to add a second Nisan, but he was Ta'abed Shmuel. He made a mistake in what Shmuel paskin, right? Chizkiyahu, of course, 800 years before Shmuel, right? Ta'ab with what Shmuel taught us eventually. Damar Shmuel said, Ein ma'abrinet hashana b'yom shloshim shel Adar. Shmuel said that you're not allowed to be ma'aber shana on the 30th day of Adar. Right? And the reason for that, of course, is that Adar might have 29 days or might have 30 days. And so when you do it on the 30th day, it is okay. It's still Adar, but it could also be Nisan, right? And so it looks wrong. Shmuel said not to do it. That is what Chizkiyahu did, and that's what he regretted. Ha'ol v'ra'oi l'kovon Nisan, because the 30th day could already be Nisan, right? Chizkiyahu initially thought, before he asked for forgiveness, ha'il v'ra'oi lo amrinan, that I don't have to worry about that possibility. In fact, there's a Braita that says what Shmuel said, so it's obviously strange to call it from Shmuel when you have a Braita, but we have a Braita that says, I skipped some words? No. Tanya Namihachi, so the bright Tanya Namihachi, Ein Ma'abrinet Hashana B'Yom Shloshim Shel Adar. You cannot announce and add an extra month of the year on the 30th day of Adar, because even though it's still the last day of Adar, you could do it on the 29th day of Adar, however, Nisan, because that day could have become Nisan, and therefore you have to treat it like it already is. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said, the fourth opinion in the Braita, we are at the third wide line, at the two dots. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, remember Mishum Rabbi Shimon, his father, not his father, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, his teacher. Nibnei shehisi at Yisrael asor Pesach Sheni. Chizkiyahu felt bad because he encouraged them to do Pesach Sheni inappropriately. What hechidami? What happened? Amar Ravashi. Well, what happened was they were close to half, not exactly. There were around the same number of people tamei and tahor. Remember, if the majority are tamei, then you're docha tuma and you just do the carbon pesach in the first time. If the minority are tamei and the majority are tahor, then the tahorim do the first pesach and the tameim do the second pesach. So this year, there was a lot of people tamei. It was around 50-50. But if you added the women, then they were all tahor, right? Nashim mashlimot l'tahorim. The women added to the tahorim, and they overcame them, meaning they added more. So then, if you add the women in the census, then more people are tahor. And those who are tamei should not do the carbon pesach on the first pesach and wait till Pesach Sheni. So that's what they did. But they got to Pesach Sheni and they changed their mind. So Meikar Savar, initially they thought, well, Nashim Rishon Chova, that since a woman is chayav to do carbon Pesach, that they should count in this kind of count for the first for Pesach. And therefore, since the women were tahor, and the men were around 50-50, havi miutin tmeim. Only a minority of the population was tamei. So the minority goes pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Miutin nidchul Pesach Sheni. But then when he thought about it some more, and so they didn't do the Karban Pesach. But later when he thought about it, he thought Lebesof Savar, well, actually, Nashim Rishon Rishut, that women are not required to do it. They are allowed to do it. And therefore they really don't count in this count. And when you go really deep, there are a few more tamei than tahor. Habile tameim ruba, right? So I said 50-50, but it wasn't exactly 50-50. It was 51-49, right? So most people were tamei. And if most are tamei, you don't do Pesach Sheni. But ruba lo mitchi, the Pesach Sheni, a majority can't be pushed off the Pesach Sheni. So basically, all of these people missed bringing the Karban Pesach because in the first Pesach, Chizkiyo's president said, don't do it, wait for Pesach Sheni. They then gave it more thought and decided, oh, you should have done it, you missed your chance, and you can't do Pesach Sheni if you missed your chance. Anyways, so that was what he asked for forgiveness. Halfway down the wide lines, let's finish off. We're almost near the end of the daf. Gufa, let's go back to what we said before. Amar Shmuel, we quoted this name of Shmuel before. Ein ma'abrinet hashana b'yom shloshim shel Adar. You should not make a leap year on the 30th day of Adar, because that day could be Nisan. So, but what if you do it? Ibru Amai. What if you go against this ruling of Shmuel and Beit Din gets together on the 30th day of Adar and they say today is the 30th day of Adar and we're going to add an extra Adar, so tomorrow will be the first day of Adar Sheni, right? Amar Ula says Ula, well then if that happens, then you just have to be very careful not to be Kadesh at Chodesh, right? If let's say you did that first thing in the morning on the 30th day, if witnesses come in the afternoon and they say it's a new month, then you're in big trouble, right? Because once you say it's a new month, today becomes the first day of Nisan. So what do? So you shouldn't be Mekadesh the Chodesh, meaning don't listen to the witnesses, which you're allowed to do. What if Kitchumai? What if they make a mistake? What if they don't realize? So in the morning, one Beit Din said, today is the 30th day of Adar, we're making an extra Adar, tomorrow's going to be Adar Bet, Rosh Chodesh Adar Bet. In the afternoon, two people show up and say, last night we saw the moon. Say, oh, today's Rosh Chodesh, it's the first day of Nisan. So what happens to the leap year? Amar Rava, Batel Ha'ibur. Says Rava, you cancel it. You can't, it's not a leap year, because once it's the first day of Nisan, the Mafreya, you can't make a leap year. Rav Nachman says, I disagree, that this is a place where actually you can have both contradictions simultaneously. Mu'ubar u'mechudash, right? It's a leap year. It's a leap year because they did that first. And today is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. I'm like Rav Nachman, said Rav to Rav Nachman, look, I don't really, it's not so clear why this is a question only to Rav Nachman, but it's a general question. He said, said Rav to Rav Nachman, nichti, look, as everybody knows, Purim to Pesach is 30 days, right? In give or take. Once Purim comes, you're supposed to start learning about Pesach. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, you start learning about Pesach 30 days before. But we're asking according to the Tanakama. Says Rav to Rav Nachman, again, this is not clear why it's only a question of Rav Nachman. What's going to happen here? People celebrate Purim. They start going to the store and buying their matzah, baking their matzah, learning about Pesach. Then a week later, you announce, oh, there's another Adar, right? So then they're not going to know when's Pesach. Once Rosh Chodesh comes, you announce, oh, it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan today, right? But we're changed our mind. We're actually going to make this another Adar. They're going to come to be mizalzel, to take light of chametz and then eat in the wrong Pesach. Amarle says Rav Nachman. Says Rav Nachman. You know what? People understand what's going on. Meida yadi. People understand. Everybody knows, right, that the decision to make a leap year is based on very complicated calculations. And they understand that it's a late decision, right? So people will say, Talia Milta, Amri, people will say, the rabbis didn't know yet. It's a late thing. So people understand the rules. It's not like you're telling them and changing your mind. They understand there's conflicting things. There's months, which we know about. There's Purim, which we know about. And there's a decision about a leap year. And you don't have to worry about people getting confused when you change it at a very late time. I am going to stop here. So we will stop right now. Last word on the line. 3 lines on the bottom and pick this up, hopefully in the right time on Daf Yud Gimel on Monday of Hanukkah. Shavua Tov, Shabbat Shalom to those who aren't in the Shabbos yet, and Hanukkah Sameach.